Good morning, everyone. Good morning. Nice to see everybody. Friends, I'm John Cavadini. I am the McGrath-Cavadini Director of the Institute for Church Life. And the Institute for Church Life is so pleased to welcome everyone on a Saturday morning of a football game. Friends, what better way is there to spend a Saturday than with the Saints? There's no better way. Why is that, friends? Friends, the saints, although they emerge from the church, the saints are not just for the church. The saints are for everyone. The saints are those people whose lives have been configured to the love of God in Christ in a way that they can reinvigorate our interpretation, our understanding of it. The saints, Pope Benedict says, are like lights. And those lights are not just for the church, they're lights that come out of the church, and therefore everyone, to expand our imagination about what human beings can be, how loving they actually can be. We're surprised when we see the saints exhibit lives of generosity and love that really go beyond what we might have imagined in every generation. So here we are. What better way than to spend a Saturday than with the saints? And in a way, it's a kind of metaphor for life. Wouldn't you like to just hang around with the saints all the time? But that's better. Friends, I'm so pleased to be able to welcome as our speaker this morning Professor Larry Cunningham, who is the John A. O'Brien Chair of Theology Emeritus in the Department of Theology right here at the University of Notre Dame. Larry is one of the foremost international scholars in the areas of spirituality, Catholicism, the saints. His studies of Thomas Merton and his editing of the journals of Thomas Merton are well known in academic circles, but then also beyond academic circles as he's carried the fruits of academic labor really into the life of the church itself. St. Francis is one of Larry's expertise also. Larry has written a couple of books on St. Francis, which have been widely disseminated and recognized. Some of you may know Larry Cunningham because of his work in Commonweal magazine, where he publishes the book notes column. So Larry's kind of the referee, you might say, out there for all kinds of literature published relating to or stemming from Catholicism. Friends, we live in an age which has lost its ear for mystery. Somehow when we hear the word mystery, we hear obfuscation, or maybe we hear puzzles, scientific questions, and mystery means eventually they're going to be solved. But the actual living mystery of the Word made flesh, the idea of mystery itself as something you could walk into and live in, this is something we've lost an ear for. And I think of Larry Cunningham's life's work as nudging us, helping us, reinvesting our imagination in this idea of mystery, and he does it by not in the abstract, so spirituality disconnected from religion and but by looking at the saints, he has, I think, reattuned or helped us retune our ear for the whole idea of mystery, and that is one thing I think which our culture is sorely in need of. Therefore, without any further ado, as introducers always say, I'd like to welcome my colleague Larry Cunningham to the podium for his talk on St. Francis.
Thank you, John. That was so generous, I could have listened to that forever. Some of you may be familiar with Butler's Lives of the Saints. First published in the 18th century, and then they've gone through many, many editions. I have the 12-volume edition of Butler's Lives of the Saints published just a few years ago for each month of the year. In the entry on Francis of Assisi, whose feast is the 4th of October, the former editor, an Englishman, said, and this is a very British comment, I think, about St. Francis, religious and social cranks of all sorts have appealed to him for justification, and he has completely won the hearts of the sentimental. I think the editor was thinking of those concrete statues of Francis with a bird on the shoulder, or parsons blessing pet turtles on the 4th of October, and so on and so forth. I've spent a lot of my time arguing that if you look carefully at Francis, he is anything but a model for cranks, whether social or religious, and he certainly was a man who was not sentimental at all. What I'd like to do today in this brief period is to reflect on the one autobiographical statement that we actually have from the saint. We have a little modest corpus of the writings of St. Francis. Most of them are prayers or variations of rules. We have 4 recorded memories of what he said to his fellow friars. And of course, we have one of the first great vernacular poems in the Italian language, the Canticle of Brother Sun. But we have very, very little autobiographical information about Francis, and this is a point that I'm going to come back to. However, simply 2 years before he died, Francis wrote a testament. And this testament was a warning to the religious order that had grown up, what was called in the 13th century a religio. This order which had grown up of the Franciscans, warning them on what they should do and what they should not do. But Francis starts this testament with the following 3 sentences. The Lord gave me, Brother Francis, thus to begin to do penance in this way. For when I was in sin, it seemed too bitter for me to see lepers. And the Lord himself led me among them, and I showed mercy to them. And when I left them, what had seemed bitter to me was turned into sweetness of soul and body. And afterwards, I delayed a little, and then I left the world. This is a very brief text, and what I want to do today is to talk about a few of the comments that Francis makes in this text. I've got a little artwork. Francis gave us inspired a great deal of art. Some scholars have argued that the rise of Renaissance art was really only possible because of the influence of Franciscan spirituality, but that's another lecture for another day. Here is a panel painted in 1235. Now, Francis was canonized in 1228. He died in 1226, so he was canonized with what in Vatican terms is almost the speed of light. He dies 1226, canonized 1228. This painting was done in 1235, and it's called the Berlingeri Altarpiece because it was done by a man named Bonaventure Berlingeri, and you can find it in the Church of St. Francis in Pescia in Italy. Those of you who are what I think they call foodies, if you love good food, you must go to Pescia. It's the asparagus capital of Italy. I once in Pescia ate asparagi al Bismarck, Bismarck style, which was white asparagus with a fried egg on it. And I ate an asparagus side dish and an asparagus salad. That's what Esquire magazine calls wretched excess. I'd like to note two things about this panel painting. It's rather primitive. It's not a Renaissance piece of art by any stretch of the imagination. The first thing I'd like to notice is that Francis is depicted with the wounds of the stigmata. If you look on his hands and his feet, he bears these circular wounds for which he was justly famous. What does that tell us? That tells us that in 1235, less than 10 years after his death, the fact that he did experience this extraordinary grace on Mount Laverna in the fall of 1224 was a widely accepted fact. I say this is interesting because in the bull of canonization which we possess, Francis's stigmata is not mentioned. And later in the century, St. Bonaventure is going to have to defend the authenticity of the stigmata against many people, especially Dominicans, who denied that it ever happened. It was the first instance of the impression of the wounds of Christ on a human being that is recorded in Western religious history. And someone may wish to ask more about that in the question and answer period. The other thing that's rather interesting about this panel painting is that both on the left of Francis and the right, there are some examples from his life. All of these examples have to do with his converted life. So we learn nothing about his earlier life from the panel painting. One, of course, very famous one, which is often reproduced, is this one, Francis with his friars preaching to the birds. Now, by 1235, we actually had a life written of Francis. It might have been written for the canonization process by a man named Thomas of Celano. He would go on to write a second life because his first life was criticized for not having enough miracles described relative to the saint, and they were very much into miracles. But we had a whole plethora of these lives, some of which were written for a polemical point of view, to argue for various interpretations of Francis's life itself. So stories of the life were widespread by the time that Bonaventure Berlinghieri paints this panel piece in 1235. And by the way, these early lives were called legenda. We get the English word legend, but in the medieval period, the word legendum in the singular, legenda in the plural, simply mean that which was read out loud, from the Latin verb legere, to read. But we learn very little about the early life of Francis from this particular painting. Francis describes his early life as when I was in the world. What was his life like when he was in the world? He was born 1181 or perhaps 1182 in Assisi. His father was a cloth merchant who traveled frequently between Assisi and Umbria up to France in the cloth trade. Francis was born while the father was away, and Francis was taken to the local church, St. George, and baptized with the name John. When his father came back, he says, no, we will not call him John. We will call him Francesco, which means the little Frenchman. This was not a common name in Italy up to this point. It became much more common afterwards. He was raised in a mercantile family. His family was not poor. The town of Assisi was divided into the majores, these were the aristocrats who lived in the castle up on the hill, the mercantile class, and then the vast number of day laborers, farmers, etc., who were called the minores. All the evidence we have is that Francis was a spoiled middle-class kid. All the things that the legends tell us about his life are the things that I complained about my own children. He loved the avant-garde music of the day, which was Provençal, French music. He loved to buy new clothes. He loved to stay out and gad about the town. For a while, he was actually running with what is quaintly called today the fast crowd. This changes when he's in his late teens, when the town of Assisi went to war with the town of Perugia, 20 or 25 miles down the road, and he was captured in this battle and was confined to the basement of the city hall. And his father, being a shrewd businessman, decided to take his time paying the ransom to get him back. So he was in this jail for practically a year. Now, I've often observed to my undergraduate students, there's nothing like a stay in the penitentiary to get your mind changed. In fact, you could write a book about all of the people in the history of Western culture who spent time in jail and got their heads turned around. One thinks of Socrates waiting for his execution. One thinks of Paul, who says, starts a few of his letters by saying, I, Paul, a prisoner in chains. One thinks of Boethius in the 6th century, who writes the Consolations of Philosophy while waiting execution up in Pavia under the Ostrogothic king. One thinks of Cervantes, who writes part of Don Quixote while he's in jail. Walter Raleigh, who writes the history of the world while in the Tower of London, or the great Meditations on the Passion of Christ written by Thomas More. I did some volunteer work as a young man at a federal penitentiary and used to tell all the moonshiners and tax evaders that were doing time that this was a golden opportunity to write a great book. This typically fell on deaf ears. When Francis got back, he was a changed person, and he didn't know quite what to make of his life. He had a great spiritual change, about which the legends are a bit mysterious. But anyway, he took up what was known as the Life of Penance. Francis refers to this in his own autobiographical statement as one, I turned to do penance. This was a common phenomenon in the 13th century where people would drop out of the ordinary cycle of life, live on the margins of society, spend a lot of time in churches, in prayer, doing work and good works and so on and so forth. He eventually, and by the way, clothing is very important in these legends, eventually he's described as putting on leather shoes, wearing a long habit with a belt and carrying a staff. That was the typical dress of the hermit of the time. Didn't join a religious order or anything. He began to work helping to rebuild a broken down church in Assisi and basically driving his father crazy. One thing that did happen in this period was that Francis came in contact with lepers. Now the lepers, we have to understand that the word leper in the medieval literature, someone who was a leprosus, didn't mean leprosy in the sense that we understand it today, that is Hansen's disease. It meant any kind of horrible disfiguring disease. A lot of what was called leprosy in the Middle Ages was basically elephantiasis that had come into Western Europe via the Crusades and the trade routes and so on. They were segregated from society. Early Lateran Council said that the church had to take responsibility that they got, that they were to get the sacraments and so on, but they were not allowed in society. And they were feared. They were dreadfully feared by people. And Francis says that I feared them, and then I grew to love them. I came where I could show mercy to them. I want you to take a look at a picture. This is one of the most extraordinary altarpieces in Christianity. It's called the Isenheim Altarpiece. It was painted less than 10 years before Martin Luther broke with the Catholic Church when he put up the 95 Theses. It was done by a man whose name we didn't even know until the 20th century. We now know that it was done by a man named Matthias Grunewald. There's a great opera, Matthias der Maler, Matthias the artist, was done in the 20th century. And this great complex panel, we're only seeing one part of it, was painted for a hospital in Colmar, on the border between Switzerland and Germany. And this painting was depicted at one end of a huge room that was a hospital for people with leprosy and with allied diseases. And if you look at the figure of the crucified Christ, it doesn't show up all that well in the slide, or the deposed Christ at the bottom, you can see that his entire body is afflicted with wounds and pustules and blood and so on and so forth. And the idea is to console the people in this hospital that Christ also was a human being and he also was a leper. Now everybody in Grunewald's time and certainly in Francis's time read the Bible in Latin. And in the passage in Isaiah, in which Isaiah depicts the suffering servant as a disfigured and shunned by men, Jerome translates that phrase from the Hebrew, saying that the suffering servant was vir leprosus. He was a leprous man. And so to see and console the leper in the medieval imagination was, in a sense, to console Christ. So there's a kind of an incarnational element in this particular scene. By the way, but I'm not going to talk about it today, these panels will close, and on the opposite side, there is a luminous resurrected Christ. So they could change this polyptych, this many-sided building, artwork, according to the time and season of the year. Here to the extreme, our extreme right, is the figure of St. John the Baptist. That figure of St. John the Baptist has written in script beside it, "He must increase, I must decrease." The great Protestant theologian Karl Barth kept that image in his study, and he would always point to that figure of John the Baptist and say, that is the task of the theologian. Christ must increase, and I must decrease. So Francis leaves the world. What is he doing? He's not quite sure. Then one day he is listening to the priest read the gospel when he's at Mass in Assisi. And the gospel reading has Jesus saying, if you would be perfect, give up everything and come follow me. Now, Francis was so struck by this saying that after Mass, according to the legenda, he went back and asked the priest to read it to him again. Francis, by the way, had very little education. He knew his ABCs. He knew how to write because we have a couple autographs. He did not have much in the way of education. And he wasn't sure if the priest had said what he thought the priest had said. So he went back and asked him, and the priest read it again. And Francis says, well, that's what I'm going to do. And in a sense, what he does is to discover or to formulate a new understanding of poverty. Now, the notion of being poor was a very old idea in Christianity. The monks, the monastic orders, which were a millennium old when Francis is alive, they practiced a form of poverty. But their idea of poverty was this, that we will possess no goods of our own. We will share all goods in common. And the great text for the monastic movement was the second chapter of Acts, which describes the early church as holding all things in common. So it was traditional in monasteries, both of men and women, never to use the word my. They'd always say, our room, our book, our church. Francis had a different idea. Francis's idea was, I'm not going to possess anything. I'm going to give away everything, and I'm going to live purely on the providence of God. And this was a kind of a radical idea. It was easy for one person to do it. It was increasingly difficult to do it if you have lots of people. This was a big problem that would arise in the Franciscan community. What happens when you have 1,000 or 2,000 or 3,000 members? That's something I will get back to in a second. But this is what Francis decides to do. Now, his father was very unhappy with this young man. It was bad enough that he was shaming the family by working with his hands. Bad enough that he was selling his father's hard-earned goods to raise money for the poor, and so on. But here's this guy now who decides that he's going to give up everything. So we have a great scene often depicted in art. This is a fresco in the church of Santa Croce, the Church of Holy Cross in Florence, done by the great artist Giotto. Dates about 1325. And it's a very dramatic scene. Here is Francis, wrapped in the cloak of Bishop Guido, the Bishop of Assisi, with the sympathetic people and a little kid down in the corner. We're getting into naturalism now, saying, whoa, what is going on here? Clearly you have the saint. And on the opposite side is Pietro Bernardone, his father, absolutely bewildered by what his son is doing, and the good citizens of Assisi to the left. Bonaventure, in his Life of the Saint, the major legend, the Legenda Maior, says that Francis took off everything, etiam cum panis, even his underclothes. He stripped himself absolutely naked, and that's why, and this is a very nice symbolic scene, the bishop is not only covering him, covering his nakedness, but also indicating that he is going to be taken under the protection of the church. You can't see it too clearly here, but at the bottom, the piles of clothes and everything, he gives back to his father. And one of the legends says that he said, up to this point, I have called Pietro Bernardone my father, but now I say, our Father who art in heaven. So how does he get the Franciscan robe? The legends tell us that there was a peasant that was nearby, and Francis borrowed his clothes and traded what he had left, and he took up what peasants in those days wore, a single gown with a hood to keep the rain off. He tied a rope around his waist, and interestingly enough, he took a piece of chalky stone and chalked a cross on his back. He became a crusader. A crusader means a cross bearer. He takes up the cross, and he begins a life of itinerant preaching, punctuated by times of withdrawal. There was a kind of a mixture of withdrawal from the world and itinerant preaching. Now, we're in the first part of the 13th century, a lot of turmoil going on. Francis knows that he needs to get some approbation from church authority, so with a few companions, he heads down to Rome, and he goes to see the Pope. And he has orally affirmed for him a simple rule. We don't possess that rule. We think that it was simply a chain of scriptural texts. And it's probably at this time that Francis also was ordained a deacon. He was never ordained to the priesthood. We're not quite sure when he was ordained, but if he was ordained a deacon, then he had the right to preach, and he came under ecclesiastical authority. And so he then goes on about his life of preaching. Now, just before Francis got this right, the Fourth Lateran Council was held in the year 1215. And it was a reforming council, and they were extremely worried, that is, the church was extremely worried about a new religious movement which was in the south of France called Catharism, the Cathars. The Cathars were a rebirth of an old heresy. Augustine fought with a species of it in his day that deprecated the Catholic Church, felt that the priests were unworthy, thought that the Eucharist was a fraud, that believed in an extreme form of asceticism that was matter-hating. It didn't like the material world, and so on. And you will not understand Francis unless you understand that he absorbed the teachings of the Fourth Lateran Council and affirmed the truths that the Cathars denied. Let me just give you a couple of examples. They come from the Testament. Francis says in the Testament that he left the world, but he had great faith in churches and priests. One of the things that Francis did, sounds a little bit idiosyncratic, but not really, is that he would clean up churches if they weren't clean. He would clean them up, straighten them up. He showed great reverences for parish priests, and so on. This was very much in line with the reforming ideas of Lateran IV. He had a profound veneration for the Holy Eucharist. It was at Lateran IV for the first time, with reference to the Eucharist, that we get the word transubstantiation used in a papal document. And Francis had this kind of complex notion that, and I'm going to give it to you very briefly because I think that he was a much better theologian than people give him credit for. They always think of him as a simple guy preaching to the birds. Francis had this profound intuition about the self-emptying of Christ when he became man. That explains his keen devotion to the infant Christ described in Luke and Matthew's gospel, and why he initiates the process of celebrating Christmas Mass in a barn with the figures described in Luke, where we get the whole Christmas crib idea, Greccio, 1223. And so Francis says that if Christ became man, God became man, he exemplified humility and poverty, first of all in his birth, and finally in his crucifixion and resurrection. And one of the admonitions says, if you believe that Christ was born an infant, then why is it difficult to believe that he is truly present in the Eucharist? That is, there was he had a kind of worked out a theology based on the notion of Christ's self-emptying manifested in various forms. He says, furthermore, that he worked with his hands. He says, I worked with my hands, and if I couldn't find work, then I begged. Because his notion of humility was based on the idea that you should identify with the poor of society, with the minores. And he says, and what do the poor do? The poor work, and if they don't work, then they sit out in front of the churches and they ask for charity. He says, and that's exactly what we ought to do also. We should be poor, following the poor Christ. The other interesting thing that he says is this. We should follow the rule, and I'm going to give you the Latin phrase, then translate it, more catholico, according to the Catholic custom. Francis was convinced that in order to lead this poor life, you had to do it within the body of the Catholic Church. This is a fresco. This is a very interesting fresco that is in the lower church of the Basilica of Assisi, and it depicts Francis, with his stigmata now, marrying Lady Poverty, depicted in these, so obviously an allegorical, with Christ marrying the two. My many trips to Assisi, I've seen this, but it always reminds me of one of the most beautiful lines in one of my favorite books, The Divine Comedy of Dante Alighieri. In the 11th canto of the Paradise, of the Paradiso, Francis is depicted. He's the central subject of the canto. And Dante says, mentre Maria stava giù, so while Mary stood below, ella, that is Lady Poverty, climbed up and embraced Christ on the cross. Simone Weil, the great French mystic, said, it's the greatest line of poetry ever written. So here we have this embrace of Lady Poverty. Let me parenthetically say, I don't want to overstay my welcome here. I want to give you time to ask questions. Let me make a point that vexed the Franciscan order. And I'll just give you an example. In 1218, they were going to have all the friars get together in Assisi. And there were about 3,000 of them by this time. And Elias of Cortona, who would become the next Minister General of the Order, said to Francis, how are we going to accommodate these people? And Francis said, our Father, give us this day our daily bread. Leave it to the providence of God. Now Elias, who was no saint, said, or at least I imagine him saying, oh, beautiful. I got 3,000 people coming, and he tells me to, trust in the providence of God. How do you handle 3,000 people Francis was not a big guy on higher education. When Anthony, who was already an ordained priest, a Portuguese canon, decides to become a friar, Francis actually writes him a letter saying he encourages him to study, but do it in the spirit of poverty. Well, does that mean you can't own a book? What are you going to do then? This issue, because it was focused on Francis, actually split the Franciscan order into two in the later generations over how literally are we to embrace the spirit of Lady Poverty. Here is, in my estimation, the greatest painting in a museum in New York City. This is Bellini's The Ecstasy of St. Francis in the Frick. So capitalist money sometimes can do some good. Of Francis praying, perhaps on Mount Laburna with the stigmata. It's a beautiful, beautiful painting of the contemplative St. Francis. By the way, this painting has just been cleaned and re-exhibited in New York. In July, I had a chance to sit and look at it for a long time. Francis never said that he loved nature. Never. But he loved all natural things. He loved everything in creation. And he wrote a great hymn about that, about how the sun and the moon and the stars and the flowers all gave praise to God. In one of the legends, he says, when you dig a garden, always trim it in flowers that you don't eat, so that you will be reminded of the beauty of God. So he was not a Dr. Dolittle talking to the animals, but someone who had this profound sense of the sacramental value of creation itself. And this was part of his whole idea of the condescension of God towards humanity. Here are people weeping outside the church with Clare, looking at the now dying Francis. One of the legends says that Francis said when he was dying, "Take all my clothes off, put me on the ground, put me on Mother Earth, and let me die close to Mother Earth." All the legends talk about, I was mentioning this to someone before the lecture began, all the legends mention something in the incidents where Francis stripped his clothes off before his father, stood naked. Once, according to one of the legends, that he took all his clothes off and put a hangman's noose around his neck and walked through a town naked. Bonaventure, a little squeamish, said, "More to be wondered at than to be emulated." And another legend says at the end of his life, he stripped himself naked and laid on the ground. Almost always, when one of the early writers says that, they quote a line attributed to St. Jerome. Nakedly following the naked Christ. That is, they saw all of this kind of Christologically, just as Christ was stripped and hung on a cross, so Francis imitates him. And then in some of the rhymed lives, they collate, or I should say they draw a parallel between the naked Francis and the naked Adam before the fall, that he sought to go back to the sinless life before Adam. So he's an extraordinary figure in the history of Christianity. Anyone who goes to Assisi will know that he draws, in fact, the Pope has been there this week, he draws people from various religious traditions and so on. But I think that if you look at his life carefully, what you will see is that Francis is one of those extraordinary living exegetes, commentators on sacred scripture. Not by his attempt to write books of commentary, but to turn his life into a commentary. And I'd like to end with a little idea that I picked up and actually used in a book on St. Francis, and it's this. The analogy is from music. We have autograph copies of the manuscripts of Wolfgang Amadeus Mozart. Almost never do they have corrections in them. It's like he sat down and just wrote these things right off some intuition he had in his head. And you can study those manuscripts to learn about the tempi and when they were written, so on and so forth. But they never come alive until they're performed. The Mozart manuscripts are a performative text. That is, they demand to be performed. And Frances Young, the great British theologian, she has said, the scriptures are like that. They're a performative text. You can have scholars interpret the manuscript tradition, comment on the language, and so on and so forth. But the scriptures only come alive when they're actually performed. And one of the great performances of all time has been John Bernardone, also known as Francesco, the minor, lived with the Minorites, who was, curiously enough, a kind of a fundamentalist. He looked at the text and said, I can do that. And he did it very, very well. Thank you all very much. Now, I'm an old classroom teacher, 40 plus years, and we always ask, are there any questions? And people always sit. So I'm going to wait 30 seconds, then I'm going to start calling on people. So, yes, please.
I'd just like to agree, so wholehearted observation that you think St. Francis was a much better theologian than people give him credit for. I wanted to use one example where he is absolutely, completely unique in his reflection and title that he gives to the Blessed Virgin Mary, when in the praises he calls her Virgo Ecclesia Facta. No one used that ever before, and it welcomes an awful lot more theological commentary, certainly other lectures. But his theologian disciples then, Bonaventure and Scotus, right through to Kolbe, pick up on that Marian component in Francis. And this is why I would just say enthusiastically in support, St. Francis was a much better theologian than we tend to give him credit for, because he himself said, I'm simplex et idiota, meaning uneducated theologically.
You sound like a Franciscan to me. Virgo Ecclesia Facta, the Virgin is the church, has become the church in a sense. We use the term Holy Mother, the Church, don't we? Yes. We should remember that for 1,000 years in the history of Christianity, the theologian, or the word theology, did not mean white-haired guys of a certain age reading books and giving lectures. It meant discourse with God. So the great monastic writer, the 5th century Evagrius of Pontus, says, the person who prays is the true theologian. The true theologian is the person who prays, conversely speaking. Thank you very much. Yes, please.
Thank you so much for this. I have a question. How would you see that the penitential movements like the Humiliati, who came as well, and all the cloths, as well the cloth business has been, how they influenced Francis' understanding of poverty and how Francis basically then formed the identity of the Franciscan order?
Right. Beginning a century before Francis's life, there was a huge discussion going on all over Europe, mainly prompted by Gregory VII, who wanted to reform the church. And the question was this: what is the best way to lead the evangelical life? What is the best way to follow the Gospels? And there were all kind of experiments in this. One tradition said, well, it's obviously to become a monk because it models the Acts of the Apostles. Others said it had to be preaching. Third group said it had to be poverty. Another one said it had to be the sharing of goods. There were huge numbers of it. Francis did not rise up like a rose in the middle of the desert. This discussion had been going on for 100 years. A man, Peter Waldo, he starts a group which later became a kind of a proto-Protestant church, the Waldensian Church in Italy. We have the Poor Men of Lyon, who attempted to do this. One side was reform-minded, and one side was trying to instantiate the gospel values, and so on. So the short answer to your question is there was a context for what Francis was doing. That is, there were reform impulses that lasted, that predated him by a long time. In one sense, he's a very traditional Catholic saint, and in the other side, he's a radically new kind of way of thinking about things, and then he puts together thought and action in a kind of extraordinary way. But there's been mountains of literature written on the context out of which Francis comes. These multi-volume work on the whole drive for a new way of understanding church. Now, I would not number the Cathars among these, but I would number groups like the lay movement in Milan, the Paterines, the Poor Men of Lyon, the early Waldensians end up way up in the Aosta Valley up in northern Italy. A lot of people. The church itself had said, no new religious orders, no new religious rules. Francis was an exception to that. The Dominicans, absolutely contemporary with Francis, they to this day follow the rule of St. Augustine. They follow the tradition. Please, ma'am, yes?
You actually gave us this question as a suggestion, but the whole idea of trusting in God's providence in religious communities and that tension you mentioned, could you carry it now further forward, kind of like a consider the lilies movement of people who like Francis would say, we needn't worry, we just need to trust in God's providence. And that stream in religious communities up to even like Mother Teresa, you hear stories about Mother Teresa like that she was opposed to thinking too far ahead and we need to pray and trust God's providence, and all these kinds of stories about how there was a need and then miraculously a need was met.
Right.
And that tension, I'm curious from Francis, I know that's a big question, but where are we on that?
Well, it's the life of Francis demonstrates very nicely this sociological truth that charismatic leaders tend to end up with the institutionalization of the charisma. Was it Renan who famously said Jesus came preaching the kingdom of God, and we ended up with the Catholic Church? I do not subscribe to that, by the way. But anyway, you kind of get the point. It's devilishly difficult to do, and I've read a fair amount about the missionaries of charity, and I know that it's a very difficult thing for any structured movement to keep that, consider the lilies of the field. You remember one of the followers of Gandhi, who attempted to live that kind of life, said one time to a reporter, if the old man only knew how expensive it was to keep him in poverty.
I remember.
You know, it probably works better at the micro level than it does at the macro level. Once the institution gets a certain size, then it becomes difficult to do. Please, yes?
Did Thomas Aquinas have an opinion on this controversy of how to deal with Protestant children?
He wrote about the vow of poverty, no doubt about that, because excuse me, the Dominicans had it also, but they understood it in a quite different way. The Dominicans from the beginning said, all the books you need, you can have. The Dominicans also said that the friars who were scholars didn't have to go to all the offices. They could, Thomas, according to his biographers, went to Mass twice in the morning and went to Compline. The rest of the time he was in his study writing. They had a much more fun, but they weren't burdened by a model of someone who tried to, excuse me, incarnate absolute poverty.
Friends, we have time for one more question.
Okay, come on, this is your big chance. Yes.
Professor, could you just comment, do you think we might be at a point where Francis' ideas, the Franciscan, we might be in an era where that could be very, very relevant to us again, the idea of environment, economy, ecology, sort of a broad view of that sort of movement. He seems to be kind of an icon in that field for a lot of people.
Not only do I think it's possible, but I think that many groups in many different ways are trying to follow those kinds of models. They may not get focused on this difficult theoretical issue of how to incarnate the notion of poverty, but this idea of living in terms of simplicity, this idea of being careful about the world in which you live, trying to live in the world of peace, etc. I could name 20 different movements that some won't succeed, others will succeed very well. Look, here's the thing about the Catholic tradition. Once a master idea gets into the tradition, it never dies. It gets into the tradition, and then you have people kind of thinking about it, trying to live it out, etc. And if it lasts long enough, it becomes what we call a school of spirituality. So you have, along with the Dominican school and the Cistercian school and what, you have the kind of the Franciscan school. And it consists of figures like Francis, texts, and so on, that people can draw on. One of the wonderful things about the Catholic tradition, let's just put a little plug in here for the beleaguered Catholic Church, is that once you, as the Catechism says, once the bishops are in union with all bishops and the Bishop of Rome, and you hold to all the essential truths of the faith and have the full sacramental life, those are the core elements of what it means to be a Catholic as opposed to somebody else. You have what I once described and was misunderstood when I said it. You have like a 200-item salad bar of resources in the tradition that will help you to live a Christian life. If you like silence, my God, we got ways to keep you silent. You know, you can become a Carthusian monk. You know, if you want to be a missionary, there are models of missionary life. If you want the life of simplicity, you've got the life of simplicity. If you like big, elaborate liturgies with lots of bells and we got that. If you like them more simple, we got that also. So once you affirm the core values of the tradition, you have more than you can actually put on a plate. They all, in a sense, teach us. And they're there once they've entered the tradition, and they stay with us and will stay with us until the end time.
Friends, with that, we've come to the end of the hour, and we have still one remaining obligation, though, and that's to thank our speaker.